When it came to beat-em-ups, the Super Nintendo was the console to have, with huge hits like Final Fight, Battletoads, and Double Dragon to name a few. You were never short of options when it came to jumping into something new, but one game that never really got its chance in the spotlight was the Peacekeepers, which was actually the third game in the Russian Beat series, and proved to be a great way to end the trilogy. After defeating the mysterious cyber gang that was causing mayhem across Neo Cisco, the city was finally at peace, but it wasn't long until a new threat stepped out of the shadows and once again saw the city at the will of an evil corporation hell-bent on world domination. After witnessing the murder of his father, Dick and his friends once again take on the mantle of saviors and set out to free their hometown of corruption one last time. Now you initially get to choose from 4 different characters, which all have their own unique movesets and attributes. You've got Dick, who's the good all-rounder, Elfin, the fast and nimble ninja, Kythrin being the slow and powerful brute, and finally Jimmy, who's the slowest of them all, but packs the biggest punch. You've got your standard punches, kicks and blocks, as well as a selection of unique special moves that help differentiate all of the characters from one another, and figuring out how to string all of their moves together is half of the fun. Adding to the depth of the fighting system is the option to counter incoming attacks, which takes a bit of time to get used to, but is best put to use against one of the many boss fights, which pose the biggest challenge throughout the game. So overall, if you've exhausted the usual suspects when it comes to beat-em-ups on the Super Nintendo, then the Peacekeepers is definitely something worth checking out for yourself. Mystic Arc is essentially the spiritual successor to the 7th saga that never found its way outside of Japan, but thanks to the passion of its fans, it's now fully playable in English. It all begins with a mysterious floating shape appearing in different worlds and turning people into statues. You end up being one of the lucky ones who are changed back to your original form, and are then guided by a mysterious voice as you travel throughout the different worlds and set about freeing all of the people who have been trapped that may choose to join you on your journey. As with most RPGs, there's an equal amount of exploring and battles that deploy an old school turn-based system with up to 3 characters being available to be used during each fight. As you would guess, each of your party members all have a unique role to play. From magic users to brutes and those that specialize in ranged attacks, there's a lot of variety when it comes to the amount of different moves that you get to play around with, and each character has strong differences in what they can equip, how they gain levels, and what they learn as they grow. For example, specific skills will only be open to certain characters, like Lux, who's a robot and can learn magic based on electrical powers, whereas weaker partners like Tokyo will only learn abilities that support your party as a whole. Now, if there was one criticism I had of the game, it would have to be how disconnected these battles feel from your surroundings. You might be exploring snowy mountaintops or dense jungles, but the backdrops for each battle are always presented in this same drab brown environment that does come across as a pretty stupid decision. Apart from that though, Mystic Arc is a great little adventure, and for fans of the 7th saga, you'll feel right at home. The Super Nintendo received its fair share of side-scrolling shooters, but one that nobody talks about has to be Spriggan Powered. At the time of its release, it received a lot of flack for its visual style, but I never really got this criticism, as the backgrounds of each stage look incredible for a Super Nintendo game, with parallax scrolling creating depth throughout each stage and plenty of scaling and rotation of enemy sprites that give the game a distinct style of its own. In terms of gameplay, Spriggan is your standard side-scrolling shooter, with the player jumping into a mech that's capable of holding its own against the onslaught of enemies that come your way. Now, you've got a few ways to deal with the threat they pose. These come in the form of colour-changing orbs that represent 4 different weapons. Each of them are dropped by different enemies, and you get to utilise their unique properties once you've picked them up. The red orb provides a machine gun that has a limited range, but a good spread pattern and rate of fire. The green orb gives you a homing shot that tracks your target but is quite weak. And finally, the blue orb forms a doppelganger that mimics each and every move you make. Even though the weapon selection might seem a bit light, they all have a role to play, and with the amount of enemies and bullets that can litter the screen at any one time, catching the orbs and switching between them at the right time creates a sense of strategy not often found in other shooters that call the Super Nintendo their home. Unfortunately, due to the visual makeup and the tricks it employs, there are a fair few bouts of slowdown throughout some of the more intense sequences, but it's nothing that ruins the experience as a whole, so if you're itching for a new shooter to jump into, Spriggan Powered is a solid option. After covering Metal Max for the DS in a previous video, I started to look into the history of the series and came across the Super Nintendo entry, and while it's not as fleshed out as later versions, it's easily one of the best RPGs on the system. What makes this game different is that there's no magic spells, no princesses or kings, no wrongs that need to be righted or world that needs to be saved. In fact, the world is absolutely fucked, with its people now living in a torn society and scattered across the wastelands that were once part of a beautiful and prosperous nation. It's essentially a Mad Max RPG and sees you stepping into the shoes of Hunter, who must build his very first tank in order to travel through the harsh and unforgiving world. What lies at the core of the game is the modding system that sees you being able to collect different parts for your tank and constantly upgrade it with new weapons and armor, or actually acquire a completely new one altogether. There's just so many different items and tanks throughout the game, and the options are nearly endless when it comes to building the perfect machine. Of course, all of these setups have a different effect in battle, which all play out in a turn-based fashion, with roughly 3 different types of enemies that come your way. You've got normal enemies that are easy to defeat, anti-tankers that are easy to kill but can deal decent amounts of damage to your tanks, and vehicle or armoured enemies that are both hard to kill and deal lots of damage, to the point that you don't want to fight them on foot. Despite a few issues with its story that only really ramps up towards the end of the game, Metal Max Returns stands as one of the most innovative RPGs of its time, and thanks to the brilliance of the systems that comprise the game, it's just as engrossing today as it was all of those years ago. Legend is a medieval beat-em-up that many people shrugged off as a simple clone of Golden Axe, and to be fair, they weren't wrong as it didn't do too much in the ways of new ideas, but its unique setting was what really helped it stand out. The visuals are by far the most impressive aspect of the game, and considering it released quite early in the Super Nintendo's cycle, Arcade Zone should be commended for taking advantage of everything the system had to offer. Each stage feels like a watercolor painting come to life, and the huge amount of detail afforded to the sprites of both the playable and enemy characters look fantastic, and that's not even mentioning there's several frames of animation that provide a smooth and believable fighting style for each of them. Of course, if the gameplay wasn't up to the same standard, then all of the eye candy wouldn't really matter, but Legend nails this aspect as well and provides you with 2 different characters to choose from and a total of 7 stages to battle through. Both of the characters have a selection of basic attacks such as kicks and swings of their swords, but also special moves such as jump slashes that cost a bit of your life to perform, as well as magic that is beholden to the amount of enchanted urns you currently hold. This system forces you to take your time, and simply bashing the buttons to defeat the sometimes overwhelming amount of enemies will not work, as there's a real cost to performing some of the more powerful attacks. But as you defeat enemies, they'll drop several types of items that replenish your magic and health, which really helps create the perfect balance between the difficulty of the game and the skill required to complete it. While not as flashy or deep as Knights of the Round or Golden Axe, Legend is still a pretty decent beat-em-up that's definitely worth a go. Monstania is an SRPG that shares a lot in common with the likes of Battle Ogre and Shining Force. Unfortunately, it would never break out in Japan, but thanks to the efforts of its dedicated fanbase, it's now got a full translation that finally brings this overlooked gem to the rest of the world to enjoy. Now, to get the bad out of the way first, the game is incredibly short and ends up feeling like a collection of battle scenarios with the occasional puzzle and story beat in between each level. This isn't a deal breaker by any means, as the quality of the gameplay more than makes up for its short runtime, with the battle system being front and center. As the player, you get to control one of 2 characters, Fron and Tia, and are able to switch between them on the fly. Despite the game's simplistic look, it does offer a lot of depth, and Fron is primarily a melee character, while Tia is ranged with her arrows and magic. Each time you carry out an action, the enemy will carry one out too, and the strategic aspect is predicting and exploiting enemy movements, which is very satisfying when you outmaneuver the monsters that litter each battlefield. To be honest, the RPG portion of the game is not that strong. You don't converse with NPCs or visit towns, there are no experience points or money either, and you have no freedom over your character's trajectory, as you automatically level up after each battle and receive weapons and new abilities at the same time. Despite that though, Monstania is an absolute gem, and proves that the old saying, quality over quantity, is what will always make the difference when it comes to good games. It's just a shame that it's quite short, as it really would have benefited from an even longer adventure, but for what is here, it's perfect. And for any SRPG fans out there, this is one game you do do not want to skip. Cosmogang is a top-down shooter that shares much in common with the likes of Galaga, but writing it off as a mere clone would be a huge mistake, as although on the surface it seems to be exactly that, it packs a fair few of its own ideas that help it carve out its own path. Based off the original version that hit the arcades, it sees you jumping into a ship and being tasked with eliminating the Cosmogang, a race of aliens who are hell-bent on wreaking havoc across the galaxy. Now there's just over 30 stages to work through, with each of them seeing the aliens spread out across the screen in a variety of different shapes and sizes as they dive bomb towards you and try to catch you out. As with most shooters though, you've got a variety of weapons at your fingertips, such as lasers and rockets, and by taking out the enemies, they'll occasionally drop a power-up that can further increase your chances of clearing the stage. These come in the form of bombs, shields, stun grenades, increased rates of fire, and even black holes that can completely wipe them all off the screen at once. The best way to play the game though has to be with another player, as this is where the action truly comes to life. And not only that, but there's specific power-ups that are only available when playing with a friend. Naturally, the rate of enemies increases, as well as the complexity of the formations they form, making for a far more challenging and ultimately rewarding experience. Thankfully, if you're looking to give this one a go, it did receive a re-release for modern consoles with both a PlayStation 4 and 5 as well as a Switch version making the rounds, so if you fancy giving it a go, it's readily available on those systems should you want to. Homebrew games have long been a huge part of the gaming landscape that have managed to breathe life into a console long past their prime, and with the Super Nintendo, this is where the Unholy Knight comes into play. Released in 2017 and developed by a handful of ex-SNK employees, it's essentially a fighting game that shares a lot in common with the likes of Darkstalkers and King of Fighters, and sees you having the choice of one of several different characters. As you would expect, they all share a string of basic moves such as kicks, punches and blocks, as well as a selection of special attacks like fireballs, flying kicks and many other creative moves that make trying each and every character essential in order to settle into one that suits your style and approach the games of this kind. In terms of control, it's the standard setup, with light to heavy hits being assigned to the face buttons, and as you battle it out and either deal or receive damage, a special meter will build at the bottom of the screen, and once it's full you get to unleash your super combo, which can flip the outcome of a fight in the blink of an eye. Of course, the game is not without its issues, and the main one for me has to be the animation of the characters that at times can be a bit choppy. It's nothing that destroys the flow of each fight, but it is noticeable, and with countless other options on the system like Street Fighter and KOF that don't really suffer from this issue, it is a bit of a disappointment. That being said, it's still an enjoyable fighting game, and the novelty of having a team working on a new game for the aging Super Nintendo definitely lends the experience a certain amount of charm. But if you do decide to give it a go, just don't go in expecting the same level of polish and mastery of the other examples of the genre on the Super Nintendo. Arabian Nights is one of the most unique and quirkiest RPGs that the Super Nintendo ever received, and it all revolves around the character of Shukran and a mysterious ring that houses a djinn known as Ifrit, as they both work towards bringing peace throughout the world. Even though that may not sound like much, the story is put together extremely well, and with multiple endings depending on your actions throughout the game, it's something that you can easily enjoy more than once. Now, the world that Arabian Nights presents is huge and is filled with many different NPCs that add to the story in meaningful ways. This grounded approach to the game's world really brings it to life in a believable way, making you want to explore each and every inch of it. But where the adventure truly hits its stride is with its battle system. It gives you the standard commands of attack, magic, items and flee, but what makes it a bit different is the use of several cards that change the effects of attacks and magic on the battlefield. There are 6 cards in total that correspond with different elements and add a serious amount of depth to each encounter. For example, a light card will make all of your attacks critical strikes, or a fire card will add an extra hit of fire to any attack you make. These effects last for a few rounds in each fight, but what makes it even more interesting is that the enemies will use cards of their own. The amount of strategy involved in each battle is second to none. That cements Arabian Nights as one of the most overlooked RPGs on the console. So if you're like me and are a huge fan of the genre and are looking for something quite unique to sink your teeth into, then Arabian Nights is just the ticket. interested in joining my Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links down below. As always, thanks for taking the time to check the video out. I'll catch you next time.